Just heard from Dr. Tony Nader, basically that there's a phase transition or paradigm shift toward a view that consciousness is primary. And something similar is taking place in our discipline of management, where we see that consciousness being primary influences what we think of and how we practice finding meaning, purpose, and how we lead and organize. And this is what our panel will be speaking about in this session 3B, quantum approaches, organizational culture approaches to oneness and flourishing. This panel has three speakers: Dr. Robert Quinn, Professor Emeritus, University of Michigan; Dr. Judi Neal, Founder, Chairman, and CEO of Edgewalkers International; Dr. Edward Sarath, Professor of Music at University of Michigan. I am Dennis Heaton, Professor of Management at Maharishi International University and moderator of this session. If you have a question for panelists, please type it in Q&A, and Dr. Maharishi will select some questions to present to the speakers. Robert E. Quinn is a Professor Emeritus at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business. His work focuses on purpose, leadership, culture, and change. He is a co-founder of Positive Organizational Scholarship and the Ross Center for Positive Organizations. He's in the top 1% of professors cited in organization behavior textbooks. He's published 18 books, including Positive Organization, Breaking Free from Conventional Cultures, Constraints and Beliefs, and The Economics of Higher Purpose. Go ahead, Dr. Quinn, thank you.
Okay, I need to screen share. And let's see if that's ready. Okay, good. And just one more moment. Okay, I think we're in business. In the last session, which I enjoyed very much, the question was raised towards the end about how do we create consciousness in workspaces? And Dr. Nader basically said three things that I captured. They said, first, it's about raising individual consciousness and then broadening it. We pay attention, and that thing that we pay attention to grows. And we have to consciously reorder ourselves on a regular basis. I think those are three really interesting statements. And I'd like to build on them for the next few minutes. In the year 2000, Kim Cameron, Jane Dutton, and I brought together a group of scholars from around the world. And we said it's time for a new effort, a new field. We called it Positive Organization Scholarship. And we basically argued social science is biased. And people said, no, it's objective. We said, no, it's biased towards something called central tendency. And we need to start to ask the question, what do individuals, groups, and organizations look like at their best? Because social science tells us about what's conventional, what's at the middle of the curve. And social science is good at looking at what happens when that order breaks down, at what's on the left side of the curve. In fact, I said to a sociologist, I'm interested in positive deviance. And he said, there is no such thing. By definition, deviance is negative. And for decades, sociology had course 101 in social order and course 102 in social problems, the middle of the curve and the left side of the curve. That's not a condemnation of sociology. It's how my brain works and how your brain works. We lean towards order, and when there's disruption, we scan for threat and we respond appropriately. We solve problems. And so those disciplines simply reflect you and I and how our brains work. Now, for 20 years, the studies have been pouring in from positive organization scholarship and from positive psychology. And the question is, what have we learned? And I want to share with you the most important thing that I've learned. And that is, first of all, there are assumptions, and we heard a lot about assumptions so far today. And those assumptions can be identified. People gather in hierarchies. They're self-interested people and they make rational decisions. Resources in those hierarchies are scarce. There's clashing interests, and people work for money. The relationships are transactional. I give you something, you give me something. We're constantly monitoring for threat. Communications filtered. Engagements restricted. And learning's incremental. Now, people, when I show this to a group of executives, they say, thank heavens I don't believe that. And I said, well, you do. All of us believe this. This is a theory unconsciously operating, but just barely unconscious, right below the chin. And they still don't believe me. So we talk about the first time their mother said, because I told you so. And when they met the bully in the first grade, and what happened in high school and in college. And after a few minutes, they agree that this is what they believe. Now, this theory drives organizing. Order constantly breaks down, it's vulnerable. So executives spend all their time over here on the left side of this curve. That is, there are competing interests. We lose communal focus. Distrust grows, fear grows, interactions filtered. We have increasing problems. And so my job is to intensify control. I run into negative peer pressure. The silos become more isolated. We burn resources. We learn from failure. And the thing we're aspiring to is to return to the middle of the curve, to return to equilibrium. Problem solving is about returning to equilibrium. Management is inherently reactive. Now, it's very painful for people when I put up this left side of the slide. They recognize the left side of the slide. Now, there's a huge space to the right of the slide that's empty. If you look at the bottom, people understand order, they understand conflict, they understand chaos, they understand collaboration. They cannot comprehend emergence. That theory in the middle of the curve is an inoculation. Now, what does social excellence look like? The clarification of purpose, shared vision, trust, authentic communication, spontaneous effort, small wins, positive peer pressure. Suddenly everybody expects everyone else give all they have. Enormous creativity. We create resources. And we're now in a place to do something that's very difficult to do, and that is to learn from excellence rather than learning from failure. And that allows us to aspire to excellence. Now, we published a book about a year ago called The Economics of Higher Purpose. My co-author is a world-class economist. The book was born when I came back from left the university for 3 years to run, I was asked to run on a voluntary basis an organization in Australia. And I vowed to lead that organization according to the principles of positive leadership. Did that, and when I came back, he wanted to know all about it. I told him what happened. It was pretty dramatic and exciting, high point in my life. He thought about it for a while, and he said, the story you just told me cannot be true. According to economic theory, what you're saying is impossible. We need to write a paper. Now, he had to teach me economics. And he said, at the heart of microeconomics is this little diagram. It's the principal agent problem. The principal is the owner. The owner pays the employee 10 units of wealth for 10 units of work. And as long as the principal is there to observe, everything's great. But the moment the principal turns his back, then the employee underperforms the contract. That's the principal agent problem. It's the base of several Nobel Prizes. This is the center of economics. We wrote a paper. It was basically a mathematical model that captured the conventional organization. We changed one variable. We introduced higher purpose. The moment we introduced higher purpose, that simulation transformed. All the agents became principles. We had intrinsic motivation. My friend was exhilarated by this. The paper became even more exciting. He said, we have to go out to the real world and interview CEOs of purpose-driven organizations. That's when I got my big surprise. More than half the CEOs who ran purpose-driven organizations, when they became CEO, did not believe in people, purpose, or culture. They got there through a crisis of some kind. And that's really important. Crisis demands reflection that we refuse to engage in normally about our identity and destiny. Now, that's suggestive of to me, of a number of things. In reading The Science of Spirituality, I was particularly moved by one paper in the work of my friend Mark Krieger and his colleagues. The first paper was published in the Journal of Leadership in 2005. And Mark did an amazing thing. He asked an unusual question. He said, I want to look at the world's 5 largest religions: Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Instead of asking what's different about them, I want to ask what's the same when it comes to learning and influence. And he came away with a 5-level model, and he said each level is inclusive of the one below. Now, rather than, I don't have the time to go through Mark's language, I'm going to give you my interpretation of that model. And I reduce each level to one word. The first level is logic, so objective analysis of the problems that surround us. We all agree that that exists. The second is imagination. That's the second level, so it's inclusive of logic. We can't cross the street without using both logic and imagination. They're intertwined. The third level is ego. When the ego governs, imagination and logic produces something. And it's cycles of ego-driven action. That is what I see every day. That's what you see every day in every transaction. We are inundated by a sea of ego cycles. And when the ego dominates logic and imagination, we produce those cycles. We therefore become determined by those cycles because we learn from them. The thing about level 3 is its transcendence. It's a movement from ego to conscience. When conscience governs imagination and logic, then we can create cycles of contributive action. We may succeed or we may fail, but we create the cycles. The 4th level is reflection on service, reflection on these cycles. If I'm paying attention to cycles of contribution, I may learn and I become enlightened. I may be a novice in the study. I may be someone who pays great attention or even a researcher, and I may become expert in understanding the cycle. But that's very different than being a master of the cycle. When someone masters the process of creating cycles of contributive action, they have the capacity to create new worlds. Coming from the transcendental meditation tradition and Heaton account, transcendental consciousness is the inner experience of one's unbounded self. I love that phrase. In 1977, Lesnick published the most controversial article in the history of the Harvard Business Review. He said, you can't be a leader until you're twice born. By twice born, he meant going through some kind of major life disruption that leads to a new view. You're reborn. You're internally directed. You begin to create culture rather than being created by the culture. You defy all of sociology. The second level, cosmic consciousness, is the constant realization of the transcendent self in lived activity. I think it has profound implications for leadership. I had a conversation 2 weeks ago with a retired CEO. He's been meditating for 40 years. He said, our son didn't come home. At 8:10 the next morning, my wife was in the shower. The phone rang. It was the police department. They said, "We have your son's body. Please come identify it." Now, just imagine the feeling when you get that message. He said, "I got the message and my body hungered for meditation. So I meditated. 10 minutes later, when my wife came out of the shower, I was at perfect peace. I spent my entire time ministering to my wife." Now, I believe that's transformative leadership. It's the ability to create transformation in any situation. Gandhi, at the start of his life, was an incredibly awkward and ineffective leader, less effective than most of the people listening to my voice right now. At the end of his life, he could transform any situation. He could stop a civil war in the middle of the Civil War. He had enormous power. The point is, he wasn't born that way. He evolved to that point. Now that leads to some concluding points here in terms of creating flourishing in the world. Do I believe in social excellence? Do I look for social excellence? Because it's a naturally occurring event. Do I learn from social excellence? Do I create social excellence? Do I teach others to see, learn from, and create social excellence? Is my class that I teach on my campus the #1 class on campus because the students get so much out of it that their lives are transformed? I think that in our research, in our teaching, in our living, in going to our department meetings, if we're studying these things, we ought to have the capacity to create new worlds. There's much more to be said about the practical aspects of learning from social excellence, but in the terms of time, I'll stop here and let's go to the next step.
Okay, thank you very much. By shining a light on social excellence, we're learning the path to a flourishing humanity. And listening to you, Bob, brings us all joy, hope, and courage for making a better world. And what Ed was saying before we started was that Judi could go next. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Judi Neal. She is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Edgewalkers International. She was a founding director of the Tyson Center for Faith and Spirituality in the Workplace at the Sam W. Walton College of Business, University of Arkansas. She received her PhD in organizational behavior from Yale University. She's a founding member of the MSR interest group in the Academy of Management. And thank you, Judi, for helping to organize this conference and our connection to MSR. Her recent interest is development of global consciousness. Judi's topic is from workplace spirituality to global consciousness.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you, Neal. Thank you both for creating this conference and for such a huge community that you're building that's going to come out of these conversations. That's very important for creating the shift we all hunger for in the world. And thank you, Bob, for that very inspiring presentation. I was thinking as I was listening to you, my first interest in workplace spirituality came about because I was sick of hearing all the things in management classes that are wrong about organizations. And I wanted to understand what was right and what was really the social excellence of highly conscious organizations. So that led me to exploring this idea of workplace spirituality that I want to talk about. So I'm going to share my slides. And let me do this so I can see things well. Okay. So I want to give you like in 2 minutes or 1 minute, my 30-year summary of what I see has happened in the field of workplace spirituality. The first thing I could ever find written about something that seemed relevant to workplace spirituality was Robert Greenleaf in his pamphlet called The Servant as Leader back in 1970.
Judi, if you can interrupt you, could you go full screen, please? Could you press the full screen button so it'll be easier to see?
Let me do that. Okay.
We can do the bottom right also.
On the bottom right?
Yeah.
That little button?
No.
No, that didn't do it.
Just to the left or to the right of it?
More to the right.
Yeah, you got it.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you. So Robert Greenleaf coined the term servant as leader, which was really a transformation from ego to a sense of being of higher service. So that was the 1970s, but not much other than some programs around servant leadership happened for the next 20 years. And then in 1990s, organizations began to talk more openly about workplace spirituality. Different organizations were like Eileen Fisher, and some things happening in AT&T and other companies were taking on contemplative practices individually and collectively, identifying spiritual values that they live by. And there started to be a huge amount of publications in business media like U.S. News and World Report and Fortune magazine and New York Times and lots of different publications around the world on workplace spirituality. So the media really got excited about this, what they were calling movement. And I think that gave courage to more leaders to quote unquote come out of the closet. So in the mid-1990s, some academics, individuals, started studying more of what was going on. And that led eventually to the formation of the Management, Spirituality, and Religion Interest Group at the Academy of Management, which really started to legitimize the study of workplace spirituality. Of course, at Maharishi International University, research had been going on during all of the 90s. I'm not sure if there was any before, but people like Dennis Heaton and Jane Wilkes-Schmidt were doing all kinds of wonderful research. But it wasn't mainstream, and I'm still not sure it's mainstream, but they were very involved in the Academy of Management and this coming together of academics to look at something that was emerging around the acceptability of talking about and researching spirituality and religion. Around the same time was the formation of a couple of professional organizations, well, several, but the two that are most well known as the Conscious Capitalism with Raj Sisodia and John Mackey, that was pretty much practitioner or leadership driven, and the Conscious Leadership Guild with John Renish and people in his sphere that also very business centric. So we have academics in one channel, and we have the professional and business leaders in another channel. And I was influenced in the mid-90s by reading this particular phrase out of a book called Creative Work by Willis Harman and John Horman, because I was thinking of spirituality on my own personal journey, my own personal involvement, and most of the people I was talking to looked at it at the individual level, which Tony Nader was talking about is the building block for more collective consciousness. After reading this quote, everything shifted for me to understanding that something more collective was emerging. He wrote, "Business, the motor of our society, has the opportunity to be a new creative force on the planet, a force which could contribute to the well-being of many. For that to occur, we must all substantially increase our commitment to integrity and courageously make a quantum leap in consciousness." That phrase really jumped out at me. Quantum leap in consciousness, beyond conventional solutions, beyond opposing forces, beyond fear and hope. And so that is what's happening now. And so in workplace spirituality is evolving into embracing this concept of global consciousness. It has evolved from a focus only on individual to individual and group, individual team, also leadership, and organizations as systems. And it's now beginning to look at interconnected systems. One of the primary drivers of this is at Case Western University and the Fowler Center, business as an agent of world benefit, and all the research that people could share stories about where business was actually benefiting the world. And some of the drivers that we see right now in the world that leading us to really having to wake up to the fact that global consciousness exists are the polarization that we see not only in the United States, but in so many other countries that's blocking the evolution of humanity and the evolution of our planet. So systems not only of business have polarization and have challenges, but also government and education and the military and the healthcare system. There's just so many organizational challenges that are slowed down by this polarization. And many presenters earlier today talked about COVID-19 and that how it's wakened us up to our global interdependence, that we need to take care of ourselves, we need to take care of our communities, we need to be generous with those who don't have the vaccines or the health care that we might be privileged to have. Others have mentioned climate crisis as part of the driver, and we heard that this morning, and Dr. Nader also talked about this oneness that climate as a problem can bring us together because we're so interdependent. The first three are problems. The fourth one, and there's many other drivers, but these are the ones that rise to the top of my awareness. The fourth one's the internet and the opportunities that the internet allows for us to come together as one humanity. There's no more boundaries. There's no national boundaries in the internet. So many of us can come together to solve problems or to create new worlds, as Dr. Nader talked about, to co-create social excellence and to tell those stories and to amplify them that Bob Quinn was talking about. So I define global consciousness through these three lenses, and again, this is not all there is, but this is what I use in my language. First of all, that it resides in an individual, that an individual can have global consciousness as part of their own development, going beyond egocentric and tribal-centric to feeling like I'm a global citizen, I'm part of this oneness of humanity. And as so many have shared, the contemplative practices, meditation and other contemplative practices really accelerate that awakening to our individual global consciousness. It's also an aspect of leadership development where people are trained in various practices, contemplative practices and practices in nature, different ways of knowing, and the idea behind that is to create a critical mass of leaders who see the world through this expanded lens. They make different decisions. They create different kinds of organizations when they come from this level of consciousness. And then finally, global consciousness is a collective phenomenon where the human race perceives itself collectively. There are moments like the year 2000, Y2K, at New Year's, when I remember watching country after country come online to celebrate the beginnings of the year 2000, and the internet did not collapse, the world didn't end. We were celebrating as one humanity. So there are experiences like that where we all feel interconnected, inseparable from nature, and it gives us the opportunity to work together to solve these global problems like climate crisis, world peace, and to not only solve problems but create something new. The goal of well-being of all living things, the more justice in the world. So we can co-create when we have this collective sense of consciousness. And people like Roger Nelson and some other organizations are studying that. So that's Roger Nelson and others are part of the Global Coherence Initiative, where they're doing scientific experiments with global meditation. And of course, Maharishi University is doing that. There's examples of business leader development from this global consciousness perspective. ITEA Institute out of Singapore is definitely one of those. People earlier today mentioned Fred Sau and Chris Laszlo, and I'm on the board of ITEA Institute. It's very exciting, the development programs that they're creating. There's organizations that focus on the economics of global consciousness, and one of those is called Future of Capital at the United Nations. And of course, research is happening, particularly through the business lens. You've got Maharishi International University, you've got the MSR, Management, Spirituality, and Religion group at the Academy. There were some students who presented their research this morning. There's Fetzer scholars at the Academy of Management that are doing research on collective consciousness in business. So there's some exciting things unfolding there. Another organization is called Pivot Projects, and it's focusing on shifting the consciousness and the activities of cities and regions, blending science, engineering, and consciousness in the way that they are helping to transform regions. And then I'm part of a Global Consciousness Initiative that's being created at George Washington University, along with Chris Laszlo and Julia Storberg-Walker, who presented this morning, and Ina Giocondi and Paul Schmidt. And our group is growing, and pretty exciting stuff is going to happen with the Global Consciousness Initiative from an academic perspective. And there's so many more organizations, but I wanted to just give you a flavor that these things are emerging, and there's all kinds of opportunities for people to play in these different sandboxes. So thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and to share this with you.
Thank you so much, Judi. What we put our attention on is what grow in our lives and in the world, and putting our attention on the oneness of humanity and the global consciousness is a thrill for us for sharing this through this conference co-sponsored by NYU. Oh, Ed. Sarath is the professor of music at University of Michigan. And he is a teacher, a performer, composer, recording artist, scholar, and an activist. He founded and serves as the president of the International Society for Improvised Music, and recently founded the Alliance for Transformation of Musical Academe, ATMA, ATMA. His most recent book is Black Music Matters, Jazz and the Transformation of Music Studies. His book, Improvisation, Creativity, and Consciousness, Jazz as an Integral Template for Music Education and Society, is the first to apply musical principles of an emergent consciousness-based worldview called consciousness theory, and is called integral theory. And his topic today is Black Music Matters, Improvisation, Consciousness in the Future. Thanks for being here, Ed.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Thanks, Judi and Bob. It's just an honor to be on the same stage. And it's great to see Bob, my colleague at the University of Michigan, who I haven't seen in many, many years. And I can almost look out my window and see his office. But it's a big university. I think we have something like, almost 4,000 faculty members. And you can go a long time not connecting with people that have shared interests, but we certainly had some meaningful interaction in the years past. I'm so honored to be part of this. And, it's interesting, the arts play, when you bring up the arts, when it comes to consciousness and these paradigm shifts and all this kind of thing, people, because people are interested in this kind of work, resonate with the arts. And so it's really exciting to be somebody involved in the arts in doing this work. But actually, when it comes to the very concrete contributions of the arts, either in the literature or just in sort of day-to-day discourse, we're lacking. The arts really we have to step up, and we have a lot of things to deliver. And so one of the things I'm working in, as indicated in the title of my talk, this word that starts with an I, improvisation. And one thing that's been very central to my life has been in my professional work is the relationship of improvisation and meditation, creativity and consciousness. Improvisation is, you might say, is kind of like a core creativity-based epistemology. Meditation is a core, you might say, a primordial consciousness-based epistemology. And you can, if we delineate like different continua, say a creativity continuum, there's all kinds of things that could go in there. We could have musical composition. We could have all kinds of planning and that kind of thing. But I appreciate that Bob in his talk, he had he didn't have the word improvisation, I don't think, but he had the word spontaneity. And that's kind of an emergence, a very elusive sort of thing, especially in the musical academy. And a lot of my energy is devoted to opening up the creative horizons of the musical academy. Now, just recalling Dr. Hagelin's remarks when he was very astutely reminding us that the academic world does not excel in terms of cultivating creativity to a large extent. He was very diplomatic the way he put it, and that's certainly true. But what we need to know story is that even in our music schools, the dominant epistemology is what? It's not improvisation or even composition. There's a few people, like the outliers, are doing those kind of processes, but it's performing and studying works that have already been created. And of course, there's a place for that. So it's a very interesting parallel to, and this is a theme I bring out in my writing with scientific materialism, reducing consciousness to a physical substrate, or even, sort of more moderately, maybe saying, well, consciousness emerges from a physical substrate, which is still far short of the principle that's coming out in this session today, and where consciousness is primary. So we have some interesting parallels between these overarching patterns in terms of the interior-based aspects of creativity and consciousness that elude the academy. Educational world's a huge site where, if these paradigm shifts are going to happen in the corporate world, if they're going to happen in society, it's got to happen in the educational world. So this is where we are. So let's go into the improvisation a little bit. Now, and also the title of my book, my talk and my book, which, by the way, I'm going to give I've got this prepared for the chat there. Now it's out for everyone. It's out in a couple of weeks, out in paperback. So instead of $90 or whatever, it is something more manageable, probably $30 or $25. And it's a very interesting issue, sort of topic now, because we're in the sort of the Black Lives Matter moment. And what we need to do is, from a consciousness-based perspective, we can take a step further, and we can realize that there's a Black Music Matters moment that actually has a lot to deliver when it comes to understanding human consciousness. And this brings us to the improvisation principle. So let's just look at the Black music tradition. Let's look at the jazz tradition. We know that the jazz tradition is a rich legacy of music improvisers. And it's a core aspect of jazz. And actually, it's important to remind ourselves that improvisation is a core thread in most of the world's music. But the thing that we don't know is it's not so common knowledge. It's not that there's a long legacy of jazz improvisers who are very seriously interested and engaged in meditation practices. So now we have this creativity consciousness link. For instance, Alex Coltrane, Turiya Sangeetananda was one of the founding visionaries for establishing Vedanta in Southern California. She founded a major Vedanta center there. And you have, Charles Lloyd and Yusef Lateef and Herbie Hancock. It's really a very long tradition of meditators. So a very vivid kind of connection there. So part of my writing goes into what are the mechanics of that connection? And one of the things I delineate is that we take this principle of self-referral, that consciousness as a self-referral, self-referential, you might say, phenomenon, where it's sort of the thing in itself, you might say from an ontological standpoint, is that it is perennially curving back on itself. In fact, if you look in Webster's dictionary, they even have something. The first sentence is something like this: "What is consciousness? It is the state of being conscious." So consciousness is the act of awareness, being aware of itself, and this manifests itself. And this is where Maharishi Mahesh Yogi has been so powerfully eloquent. In terms of, I mean, I feel very privileged to have had some moments hearing him expound on how that plays out on a cosmic scale. I mean, he would go on for hours and hours and hours talking about the sequential unfolding of the entire cosmos from this self-referral process, giving rise to the fundamental particles, and then, of course, like, more and more differentiated scales of creation. And so when we look at that, we can actually map that out onto individual creativity too. So that's what I've done with improvisation. So along what you might call the creativity epistemological continuum, improvisation is and there's different kinds of improvisation. So in music, we have what's called free improvisation, just what we might say is pure improvisation, is the most self-referral operation, you might say, along that continuum. It is the most purely within the realm of activity, manifestation of consciousness curving back on itself, in within the context of sounds. Now, along the contemplative or the consciousness continuum, pure consciousness, that's come up at least a couple of times. Dr. Nader mentioned it. In terms of talking about meditation. And I mean, we don't have to look far. There are many, many kinds of meditation. It's a beautiful thing in our world. But what I tell my students is favor or include something in your pursuits, include a meditation modality that has an anchor in pure consciousness. So, and I realize that my time is coming up here, so I'm gonna move quickly here. So another thing of what I've done, this also links with some of the beautiful, powerful themes that have come up. Judy's talking about global consciousness. Bob is talking about the economics of higher purpose. Dr. Nader talked about just, this whole theme of consciousness as primary in the cosmos. The improvisation has another really fruitful line of connection here, in the fact that, and Judy, by the way, I loved your three levels of the global consciousness, and this is definitely compatible with that. But the idea in improvisation that within the realm of activity, we merge profoundly. When you read that, you talk to improvisers, and they talk about in peak moments of improvisation. So now Bob would like this too, because now instead of studying, there's times that improvisation doesn't go so well, but let's study the times it does. These peak moments, improvisers talking about merging with each other to a point of, this goes beyond sort of a sense of oneness, which is nice, to what you might call something that's, it's an ontologically veridical experience of interconnectedness. And of course, MIU, Maharishi International University, if people have not been there, if you drive on Highway 1 from Iowa City, that's how I usually coming from I-80, you're going to come through a lot of cornfields, and then you're going to see these two huge golden domes jutting out on the countryside, and that's where the group dynamics of collective consciousness are practiced there. And I think that's probably, I've probably gone over time. Maybe I'll have some things to say in the question and answer. But thanks, Anil, for the organization of the event, and I'm so happy to be part of it.
Well, thank you, Ed, for bringing up the important topic of Black Music Matters, which is associated with the rising appreciation in our society that Black Lives Matter. Thank you. And having some degree of responsibility as a dean in our university, I know there's an element of improvisation involved every day. Max Dupree wrote a book called Jazz Leadership, comparing it to a jazz ensemble. And we'll have time for questions for all of our participants. And I'd like to start by asking a question to Bob Quinn, and also encourage the panelists to comment to each other, particularly to find convergence about main principles of working towards a flourishing, universal human flourishing. So, Dr. Quinn, positive organizational scholarship started there in the early 2000s. Do you feel that this trend of putting attention on social excellence is accelerating in academia?
Several reactions. One is I think that both positive organization scholarship and positive psychology, which are very overlapping fields of work, are now well rooted and are growing. I think that we've heard, if you go through Judi's list, for example, there are all kinds of things happening that then link with that stuff. And so the more chaos we experience, and certainly we've had lots of it in the last year, but it's been building for a very long time. And it was predicted a lot in the 60s and 70s in a lot of popular books that we would overwhelm the capacity of hierarchy to process the information coming at it. And I think we look at political leaders, not only in this country, but other countries behaving in fairly similar ways, and we have lots of reaction and point at them. But I think there's something much bigger happening, and they're just a symptom of what's going on. And so we have a constant churn and constant differentiation, splitting out. Now, the more that happens, the more need we feel for the integration of differentiation. And I think all of that becomes an engine, and therefore the things you're asking about are very alive, they're growing, and I can't imagine that they'll stop.
I think the discipline of management is searching for a new way of thinking, because this whole competitive economic model, which says that things, the work you did on economics of purpose, is coming to some dead ends, and everybody's trying to think, what is a new model for organizational studies, for economics? What do you see as emerging, or the future of organizational theory?
First of all, I think everything that exists plays a function. And so economic theory as it is, I think is the most powerful, rigorous, predictive social science. And I think we should value it. It also has blind spots. It doesn't see the transcendence of ego. It can't see social excellence. It can't therefore create social excellence. And people have to go through a dramatic life change to get there and to become leaders. And so it's hard work. We will always be at a disadvantage in this kind of work because the first system is always going to be. I loved when Ed said, I wrote it down. Ed was turning a critical eye on the world of academia, and particularly his own world of the arts. And
I remember he said that music is focused on performing other people's compositions.
Yeah, the analysis of what people have already composed. Now just think of every business school on the planet. The enormous leaning is to do exactly that. We analyze what is and how it breaks down. We don't lean towards what needs to be created. Now, in the notion of purpose-driven leadership, most companies feel the pressure today, for reasons we just discussed, to have a purpose. They create a purpose that's totally hypocritical, and they make their organization worse off because they increase the cynicism. The notion of having an authentic higher purpose that increases our integrity and unifies our people is outside economic reasoning. Now, again, it's not about economic reasoning is wrong. It's about the expansion of economic reasoning. And I think that's what we're all about.
Thank you. I noticed we're getting to that. There was a Q&A for Dr. Neal. What do you see the potential roles cities can play as an entity to engage with consciousness growth practices? From David Wick.
Well, first of all, hi, Ken. I'm so glad you're joining us. It's, I'm sure, the middle of the night for you in Japan. And I love your dedication to learning anything you can about workplace spirituality. I'm actually involved in the creation of an appreciative inquiry summit for the city of Fayetteville, Arkansas, where I live. I'm part of a core team that's designing an event in September. We begin all of our planning sessions with something contemplative, because we see ourselves as holding the space for citizens to be able to have a voice in the future of this. We're a wonderful city, we're a highly conscious city, but we are holding the vision of this city going to the next level of consciousness to be a model for other cities. And we're also inspired by other cities who are doing similar things. And we're part of that Pivot Projects that I mentioned in my talk, is an international organization that's linking up cities that are doing social excellence, as Bob talked about. And it's very improvisational, as Ed talked about. We're making it up as we go. We're trying to really be in a high level of attunement with each other and with all of the members of our community. And I know other cities are trying to do that. We have to put faith, spirituality, higher purpose, consciousness at the center of what we're doing, seeing our cities as holographic for all of humanity. And that we're not separate for what's emerging for humanity and the planet. So it's a very exciting time, and there's so much to learn from. We learn as we go here in Fayetteville, but we learn from others at the same time, and we hope to share wisdom and experiences, including our failures, what works, what doesn't work. We want to share that with others. So thank you for that question. I think cities can make a huge difference in this collective shift.
Thank you. You know, we have a question for the whole conference, which is still main principles for a path to flourishing humanity. And I heard you say that I think you would say is the main principle is putting some consciousness of purpose and consciousness of spirituality at the center for transformation. Elaborate on that.
Was that for Ed?
No, that's for you, Judi. Just like a main principle. If what you've said could be boiled down to a generalizable principle about the path.
Thank you. You know, Janelle King answered that question in the research paper session 1, and I would give the exact same answer. The key principle is love. And I think that one expression of that love is knowing that we're all interconnected, that we all are one. So to spend time and energy living in that oneness, whether it's in our contemplative practices or it's in our actions in the world, whatever those actions and passions are for, when it comes out of that love, when it comes out of that oneness, and ego is subsumed and lost and just melts away because there's something bigger that you're a part of and resonating with, I think that's one of the key principles that is essential for creating a flourishing humanity.
Well, thanks so much. And I have a question for Ed. I asked Bob Quinn if there was an accelerating trend in the discipline that he's in. And do you see any transformation accelerating in music studies?
You know, it's such an interesting thing, and I love this kind of question because we can learn so much by seeing the patterns. This is such an interesting moment. We had COVID. In fact, right now we're at a year. We're coming up on the 1 year mark of the George Floyd murder, and this, you know, I mean, we all saw that this and other murders of African Americans have really triggered a kind of reckoning with the issue of race on a you know, and I talk to a lot of colleagues of color just to check myself as a white person, you know, because it seemed to me, wow, we're having a conversation about race that we have not had yet, and I get a lot of confirmation on that. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do, but here is music studies is such a great example, and I think Bob has been really articulate about this. You know, we could have a symposium. You know, we have make it a competition. Which discipline is the most paradigm blind? You know, the most paradigm oblivious to themselves as, you know, their patterns. So just to give you an idea, you know, I said before, and I was happy that it was reiterated that, you know, music studies is about recreating or interpreting the art object through performance and study. And it's not just any old art object; it's a collection of art objects that largely were created in Europe of centuries past. And the question is not the greatness of this work; it's great, but there's a lot of other great and important work that's been marginalized. So what's happened in music studies is, on an unprecedented scale, in the past year, music schools really got into the racial justice business, at least in rhetoric, and I'm sort of in the middle of that conversation now. So, you know, so a year later, we ask ourselves the question, so what's new in the conversation? What's new in the action? Because there's an awful lot of talk. And the thing is, you know, I teach at the third ranked school of music in the country, at least usually in the top 5. So I know a little bit about what I'm talking about. Plus I'm very, you know, in circulation with leaders of, you know, many schools. The thing is, and there's a message here for the world too. So this hits on the question. The patterns, you know, from the standpoint of say Maharishi Vedic science, okay, you know, a consciousness-based worldview. From the standpoint of like sort of the chundas, the objective entrenchment of music studies paradigm, it goes so deep. It goes way deeper than most people realize. And I think this is where we need, as activists, as visionaries, and one of the great things now is that all these are coming together. Certain people are doing social justice activism, other people are corporate vision, other people are musical visionaries. Like the great thing when we bring consciousness in, it's like all those labels, there was something in the chat here about this, all these labels that divide us, basically, even divide us between conservative and liberal and that kind of thing. From a consciousness-based standpoint, we get very different readings, not totally different, but different layers of sort of the political debate play out or sort of take hold in different ways. It's very interesting. But I think one of the important things now that as visionaries and leaders that we need to be vigilant on is that it's creating differentiation within the activism itself. So you've got, you know, everyone now, or like, you know, like most of the people we all know, right, are like are committed. At least they'll talk about being committed to the racial justice imperative. But the question is, when we really kind of do due diligence in terms of the kind of work that's needed to dislodge. And as Bob was saying, you know, like he was quoting, you know, his colleague, to be twice born in a way. You know, we could even say thrice born, You know, I mean, we could, you know, that again, that's kind of like a self-referral loop in itself. It just keeps on curving back on itself. Anyway, I got a little distracted here, but to answer your initial question, music studies, as the world, has a lot of work to do.
Thanks. There was a question for you, Ed, from Barbara Nussbaum, and she wanted to know what it is about music that makes this emergent experience of unity possible. And I think this relates to one of the overall themes of the conference of looking at various experiential paths to unity.
Yeah, I could be real quick. I mean, I love this question. I just don't want to use up other people's time. This is huge, actually. So there's two lines of inquiry here. Along sort of the process line, and we could also look at it along sort of a structural line, looking at sound itself. But in terms of the improvisation process, the listener tunes into what you might call the cognitive information processes of the artist, the improvising artist. And this, of course, brings in collective, you know, if consciousness is indeed intersubjective, not just a feeling, but actually, you know, our individual consciousness is part of this overarching field of consciousness. And this, of course, is implicit in the idea that consciousness is primary. Then it just follows, and you know, we have plenty of anecdotal, at least, you know, support for this, that the listener actually can attune to that sort of transcendence in action. Okay, so that's along one line. And then in terms of sound, and of course, this is an age-old principle, and definitely in, you know, in Hindustani classical music, North Indian classical music, this is huge. That, but in many traditions around the world, that actually musical sound is, of course, this the Vedas itself. Musical sound is primordial vibration. So the building blocks of musical sound, musical syntax, are just manifestations of the basic frequencies, which is nothing but, as I was saying before, consciousness reverberating within itself. I hope that's a great question, Barbara.
Yeah, that reminds me that there's some music in the program at 9 p.m. Central Time on Saturday that I've been asking the presenters to talk about a transformation that we're seeing on the level of the individual, the organization, and the world. And these panelists that we've heard are speaking from their own awakening of consciousness. They are shining a light on the path to a flourishing humanity. In the 1970s, the founder of our university, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, inspired us to be alert to the signs of the transformation of humanity from an age of ignorance to opposite principles in an age of enlightenment. Quinn's work illuminates such a transformation for organizations from rigid top-down hierarchies in which people are driven mainly by self-interest and fear to a different mental map where organizations are networks of fluid, evolving relationships, where people are motivated by the desire to grow, learn, and serve a larger goal. And throughout this conference on consciousness-based management and leadership, we will hear many other happy signs of an enlightening shift in the profession of management. At MIU, we started a PhD program in management to advance the evolution of individual and collective consciousness to create flourishing. We asked the question, how does evolving consciousness express itself in new management practices and forms of organization? And so we very much appreciate what we can learn from our keynote speaker, Bob Quinn, and the other scholars of positive organizations, and to keep our eye attuned to new things as they emerge and are created. So thank you, Bob, and thank you, Ed and Judi, for demonstrating the rise of consciousness and integral thought for practice, for artists and change makers. And to conference attendees, please stay tuned for more positive stories about how consciousness-based mindset is reshaping the theory and practice of management. The next session is at 6 p.m. today. The title is Connecting Individual and Collective Spiritual Mindset with Shaping a Better World. And we'll see you then. Thank you for attending.